Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? No names, just yes or no.
At my sister Melanie's baby shower, the air was thick with lavender-scented candles, pastel decorations, and this kind of forced cheerfulness that only really exists at events where people are trying too hard not to say what they're actually thinking. The living room was stuffed with women from both sides of the family, coworkers Melanie hadn't spoken to since her second trimester, and that one neighbor with the fake lashes who always brings deviled eggs nobody eats. There was a decorative chalkboard near the window that said, "Welcome, baby girl. Can't wait to meet you," with little hearts drawn around the words, and underneath that, a gift table groaning under the weight of pink gift bags and wrapped boxes with glittery bows. It looked perfect, Instagram perfect even. Except nothing about this day, or the people in it, was as sweet as it pretended to be. I was leaning on the kitchen counter, sipping from a plastic cup of lukewarm punch and debating whether I could fake a headache and sneak out when my mom suddenly appeared beside me. She touched my elbow like she always does when she wants to seem gentle, but is really about to say something controlling. Her voice dropped low, lower than the soft music playing from the Bluetooth speaker, and she said, "Lauren, listen. Don't mention the paternity rumors, okay? Melanie deserves her happiness today. Just keep things nice." Now, here's the thing. When your own mother gives you a warning like that in the middle of a baby shower, when the cake hasn't even been cut and the guests are still playing Guess the Due Date, your stomach drops a little. Not because you planned on saying anything, but because someone else clearly might. Or worse, because you know too much. And so I nodded, the way I always do with her, because years of being the good daughter have taught me that nodding keeps the peace even when your whole body wants to shout. But I was still watching, still scanning the room, because I had that tight feeling in my chest that something was coming. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was memory. Or maybe it was just because every time Melanie smiled that day, it looked like she was daring someone to ruin it. Tyler, her boyfriend, or fiancé, or whatever we're supposed to call the guy who knocked her up after 6 months of dating, was standing near the fireplace, nervously adjusting his shirt sleeves and checking his phone like it owed him an explanation. He looked pale. Paler than usual. Not like sick pale, more like, I might say something I can't take back, pale. And just as my mom turned to refill her glass of Moscato, he tapped the side of his champagne flute with the back of his fork. It was a small sound, barely audible, but the entire room hushed like someone had flipped a switch. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. One of Melanie's friends stopped mid-laugh. Even the Bluetooth speaker glitched for a second, like it too was waiting. "Hey, everyone," Tyler started, his voice slightly shaking. "Before we open gifts, I have something I need to say. I know this isn't exactly tradition, but I've been carrying this for a while now, and I think Melanie deserves honesty more than anything. And I swear to God, you could have heard a pin drop." Melanie blinked once slowly. Her smile froze on her face like it was glued there. Mom put her glass down too hard, and it made that sharp clink against the counter. Aunt Cheryl, bless her loudmouth soul, muttered, "Oh, hell," under her breath, and leaned forward in her chair like she was watching a car crash about to unfold in real time. For a split second, I thought maybe Tyler was going to propose. Maybe he was about to pull out a ring and try to create some magical redemption arc to distract from the whisper campaign that had followed Melanie's pregnancy from the moment she posted her ultrasound on Facebook. But the way he looked at her, not with joy, not with love, but with guilt, told me this was something else entirely. I gripped the edge of the countertop. I thought about my mother's words. "Don't mention the rumors." As if the rumors hadn't been floating around every family dinner for the last 5 months. As if I didn't hear them at the grocery store when Melanie wasn't looking. As if I didn't know what Tyler didn't know. Because here's what no one talks about, not in church, not in holiday newsletters, not even in quiet conversations with too much wine. Families keep secrets like heirlooms. They pass them down, polish them up, hide them behind polite smiles, and let's not get into that size. And for years, I played along. I smiled. I nodded. I let Melanie shine while I swallowed what I knew. But this time, the secret wasn't just petty or painful, it was about a baby. A real child who was about to be born into a lie. And whether I liked Melanie or not, and trust me, That line had been blurry since college. I cared about truth more than I cared about her curated happiness. And as Tyler inhaled like he was about to rip the bow off a ticking time bomb, I realized something else. He didn't know the half of it. He thought this confession, whatever it was, would clear his conscience. But it was only going to open a door none of us were ready to walk through. I looked over at Melanie. Her hands were on her belly. Her jaw was clenched. Her eyes locked on Tyler like she was daring him not to finish his sentence. And, for a moment, I wondered if maybe she knew what he was about to say. Maybe she knew it wouldn't matter. Because the bigger question wasn't what Tyler was going to say. It was what I was going to do next. And I honestly didn't know. Not yet. The room didn't breathe. It just paused. It was as if everyone had been frozen mid-blink, mid-sip, mid-fake smile, waiting for Tyler to say something rehearsed, something forgettable. Maybe even something sweet and cheesy like a toast about becoming a father or how grateful he was to be part of this family. But no one in that room was prepared for what actually came out of his mouth, least of all Melanie, who sat stone-still in her armchair, one manicured hand resting protectively on her very round belly, the other clenching the satin ribbon of a gift bag as though she might need to strangle someone with it in the next 5 seconds. Tyler's voice wasn't loud, but it carried, not because of volume, but because of weight. There was something in his tone, this kind of forced bravery wrapped in panic, like a man jumping off a cliff, but still hoping for a ledge halfway down. He looked at the crowd of expectant eyes, then directly at Melanie, and said, "I made a mistake a few months ago. One I've regretted every day since." He paused, glanced down at his shoes, and then exhaled like he was trying to let go of whatever was choking him from the inside. "It was before we found out about the baby. I was drunk. It didn't mean anything. But it happened. And I felt like you deserved to know. I should have told you then, but I was scared. I still am." For a second, no one reacted. It was as if the entire party had slipped into some weird alternate reality where confessions like that were just accepted background noise. Melanie didn't move. Not a blink. Not a twitch. Not even a twitch of her perfectly lined lips. Her silence wasn't confusion, it was calculation. You could see her mind doing the math, evaluating the fallout, prepping the pivot. My mom was the first to speak, and of course, her voice came out way too bright and high-pitched for the moment, as though she thought she could force normalcy back into the room by sheer volume alone. "Okay, well, that's very brave of you, Tyler. And I'm sure we all appreciate your honesty, but maybe this isn't really the time." But Melanie raised one hand, not fast, not frantic, just a slow, deliberate gesture that made my mother go instantly quiet. It was one of those gestures you see in courtroom dramas right before someone says something that ruins 3 lives in under 30 seconds. And then Melanie smiled, or at least something that pretended to be a smile. "Are you done?" she asked, still smiling, still looking directly at Tyler as if no one else in the room existed. Her voice wasn't angry. It wasn't even cold. It was something much worse, it was empty. Tyler, already pale, looked like he might faint, and all he could do was nod, weakly, like a kid who just realized his punishment was going to be much worse than he thought. And that was when it hit me. Melanie had known. Maybe not about the exact timing, or the woman, or the drunken excuse, but she had known something. You don't look at someone like that unless you've been preparing for this moment for a long time. She hadn't just accepted that Tyler was unfaithful. She had stored that betrayal, categorized it, and placed it on a shelf next to all the other secrets she kept hidden behind that curated life of inspirational quotes and filtered maternity photos. But while the room buzzed with awkward coughs, nervous laughter, and a few too loud attempts to shift the topic back to cupcakes or diaper raffles, I couldn't stop thinking about something else, something far worse than Tyler's pathetic confession. Because the cheating, as bad as it was, wasn't the part that made my skin crawl. It was the timeline. Before we found out about the baby, he'd said. Not before she got pregnant. Before they found out. And that little detail made all the difference. Because if Tyler had been cheating around the time they found out, not before the pregnancy, but before they knew about it, then the chances that he was actually the father, well, they were suddenly a whole lot messier. Messy in a way Melanie never wanted anyone to question. Messy in a way that confirmed everything I had started to suspect when she suddenly went radio silent for 2 weeks last year and then showed up at brunch looking like she hadn't slept in days. And here's the part that still makes me mad. Days later, even after I've replayed the scene in my head 100 times, I almost said something. I almost opened my mouth and asked the question floating just under the surface of everyone's forced smiles. Are we sure Tyler's the father? But I didn't. I just stood there, gripping my plastic cup, pressing my nails into my palm, and thinking about a night almost a year ago when Melanie had shown up at my door unannounced. She'd been crying. Not her usual I need attention tears, real, ugly, terrified crying. She said she'd made a mistake. She said she didn't know what to do. And when I asked her what happened, she'd just shaken her head and said, "It doesn't matter. I'll figure it out." I hadn't thought much of it at the time. We weren't exactly close. She never came to me unless she needed something, a ride, a cover story, a favor she couldn't ask Mom for. But now, standing there in that fake pink room full of glitter and suspicion, that night came back to me in full detail. And I realized with absolute certainty that the mistake she'd been crying about wasn't Tyler. It was someone else. Someone I hadn't thought about in a while. And just as I was trying to shake the thought away, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, expecting maybe a bored text from a friend or a silent lifeline from a cousin equally desperate to leave. But it wasn't that. It was Melanie's phone. She'd left it on the kitchen counter while she opened gifts, and the screen lit up with a preview message that made my stomach tighten into a fist. Does he still think the baby's his? The contact name was Paul. And just like that, the past walked right back into the room, uninvited, smug, and ready to burn everything down. For a moment that felt like a slow, dragging eternity, I simply stared at the glowing screen, the words branded into my mind like a hot iron pressed against old wounds that had never quite healed. Does he still think the baby's his? 7 words, plain on the surface, yet heavier than any box on that carefully curated gift table, and far more explosive than anything Tyler had just admitted in front of 50 guests and a table full of pastel macaroons. The contact name didn't even try to hide its intent. It was Paul. And with that one message, the floor under my feet shifted, though no one else in the room seemed to notice that I had stopped breathing. It's strange how certain names carry entire histories inside them, like a suitcase you've never unpacked, too afraid to see what you shoved inside years ago. Paul, he wasn't just an ex. He was the ex. The one who took something from me and then had the audacity to pretend it was never his to begin with. When we were together, back in that blurry stretch of my late 20s when I still believed things like love and loyalty came wrapped in each other, I thought he was different. Not perfect, no one is, but real. He listened. He cared. He asked about my job, my goals, my frustrations with our family dynamics, and he didn't flinch when I told him I hated how Melanie always got away with everything. He even said once, while we were lying in bed, that he liked how I saw people, not as they pretended to be, but as they truly were. That version of Paul had vanished the night he stopped returning my texts, the week he canceled our dinner plans without explanation, the moment I saw his tagged photos on Melanie's Instagram from a beach trip I hadn't even known she was on. They'd both smiled for the camera, dripping wet in the sun, her bikini top too small and his hand unmistakably resting on the curve of her hip. I remember feeling cold all over, that sharp kind of betrayal you don't cry about right away because you're too stunned to register what's just hit you. When I confronted Melanie about it back then, when there was still some thread of decency I assumed existed between us, she had the nerve to act surprised, as though I was being dramatic, as though Paul and I hadn't been something real. She insisted it happened only after we broke up, said it just sort of happened, and that they weren't serious anyway. And our mother, always the peacemaker when it suited her, told me that maybe it was time to move on, that Melanie didn't mean anything by it, that sometimes these things just happen, and we have to rise above them. I did move on, or at least I pretended to, because that's what women in my family are taught to do, smile through it, drink some wine, and bury the rage in polite small talk. But I never forgot. And now, standing in this kitchen with her phone in my hand and that message glowing like a torch in a cave of old lies, I felt that old betrayal twist itself into something new, something razor-sharp and cold. I didn't open the message. I didn't need to. The implication was clear. Paul, after all these years, after ghosting me, dating my sister, and then fading back into whatever self-important tech job he worked now, was back. Not just back, but possibly connected to Melanie's baby, the baby we had just thrown an entire party to celebrate. The layers of it made my skin crawl. Tyler's confession, as reckless and humiliating as it was, suddenly looked quaint next to the reality of what might be true, that Melanie was pregnant, that the father might not be her boyfriend, but her sister's ex, and that she had, once again, managed to place herself at the center of a storm she pretended not to see coming. I could have said something right there. I could have walked over, lifted the phone high like some kind of courtroom evidence, and read the message aloud to the entire damn room. I imagined it, the gasps, the dropped forks, the look on Melanie's face cracking under the pressure of public exposure. But instead, I did what I've always done. I played it smart. I took a breath, kept my face neutral, angled the phone slightly so no one could see, and quietly sent the message to myself. I created a fake email address in under 20 seconds, attached the screenshot, and sent it to my inbox before wiping the screen and setting the phone back where she left it. It wasn't panic I felt, it was precision. This time, I wasn't going to let emotion get in the way. This time, Melanie wasn't going to walk away untouched. As the baby shower limped forward, people whispering behind coffee cups and pretending the tension in the room hadn't just solidified into something nearly visible. I watched Melanie open gifts with an exaggerated cheerfulness that now struck me as performance art. She cooed over tiny onesies and clutched handmade blankets to her chest like they could protect her from what was coming. Tyler sat beside her, his smile stretched too thin, his eyes darting between her and the guests like he wasn't sure what kind of damage he'd just done, or if it was already too late to fix any of it. And I stood quietly in the corner, my plastic cup long empty, watching it all unfold with the calm of someone who's finally seen behind the curtain and realized the whole show is just wires and mirrors. My mother was trying to salvage the mood, fluttering from guest to guest, laughing a little too loud, offering cupcakes and cookies like sugar could erase suspicion. Aunt Cheryl, bless her directness, had already made a comment about how timing sure is everything, and she wasn't wrong. Because that message, those 7 simple words, had unlocked something in me I thought I buried. Not just anger. Not just betrayal. But a kind of slow-burning fury that didn't want to scream or throw plates. It wanted something quieter. Something permanent. I didn't know exactly how I'd use what I now had, that screenshot, that smoking gun, that text from a man who had once kissed my forehead and then handed my heart to someone else, but I knew it wouldn't be immediate. No, I wasn't interested in impulsive revenge. I wanted patience. I wanted to wait for just the right moment. Because if Melanie wanted to build her happiness on a lie, then I was going to make sure it crumbled from the inside, brick by brick, and I would do it without raising my voice or lifting a finger, just a few well-placed truths, exposed at the perfect time. And the whole damn thing would collapse. And maybe, just maybe, then she'd know what it feels like to watch something you love get taken from you while everyone else smiles and calls it fate. There is a particular kind of power that settles deep in your bones when you hold a truth no one else knows, not a truth whispered carelessly at a dinner table, not a gossipy suspicion muttered behind a hand over coffee, but a real, unshakable, devastating truth, the kind that could shift the ground under someone's life without ever making a sound. And after that baby shower, after I forwarded that message to myself and watched Melanie hold up a hand-knitted pink sweater while the room tried to pretend that Tyler hadn't just detonated a small emotional bomb in the middle of the afternoon, I realized I had something more dangerous than anger or bitterness. I had leverage, and I wasn't about to waste it. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was trailing behind Melanie's golden child glow, watching her from the shadows as she manipulated situations to her benefit with that effortless charm she'd always worn like a designer coat, fashionable, expensive, and entirely undeserved. I wasn't playing the role of the forgotten sister or the family disappointment, the one who didn't settle down fast enough, didn't follow the rules, didn't smile enough at Thanksgiving. I was done pretending that keeping the peace was worth swallowing the truth. And so I began to plant seeds, not accusations, not outright sabotage, just subtle, quiet nudges placed precisely where they'd be most effective. It started small, almost harmless. I called my mother the following week under the pretense of checking in, knowing full well that any tone of concern in my voice would instantly engage her need to stay ahead of any developing drama. I said things like, I can't stop thinking about what Tyler said. It's just the timing, Mom. Doesn't it seem off to you? I didn't say what I really wanted to say, that Melanie was likely lying to him, to everyone, and that there was a real possibility the baby she was carrying belonged to a man she once swore meant nothing to her. But I knew my mother, and I knew that leaving the details vague would allow her imagination to do most of the damage for me. The less you say, the more people fill in for themselves, and they almost always fill in something worse. I also made sure to mention Paul's name, casually, like someone dropping a stone into a still pond just to see how far the ripples would travel. Wasn't Paul living in Atlanta last year? I asked. That's when Melanie went to that spa retreat, right? Funny coincidence. I said it lightly, breezily, as though the connection had only just occurred to me, though I'd been piecing the timeline together with surgical precision for weeks. I didn't need to accuse. I just needed to suggest. And sure enough, within days, I heard from Aunt Cheryl, the family's most devoted carrier pigeon, that Tyler had been acting strange, asking Melanie questions she wasn't ready to answer, growing colder each time she deflected with that over-rehearsed sweetness she used when cornered. But it wasn't enough to shake things loose. Not yet. Melanie had always been slippery, always able to twist truth into whatever shape she needed to survive, and I knew she wouldn't unravel just because her boyfriend had doubts. That's when I decided it was time to be more direct, not loud, not explosive, but surgical. I created another fake email account, something anonymous and untraceable, and from it I sent the screenshot of Paul's message to Tyler. No commentary. No signature. Just the image. I wanted him to see it, to absorb it in silence, to be alone with that truth before confronting anyone else. I knew if I presented it as evidence from an outside source, rather than a deliberate act of sabotage from me, it would have more weight, it would look less like an attack and more like a revelation. And it worked. 2 days later, I got a call from Mom, her voice panicked, brittle, like she'd been pacing her kitchen since sunrise. She told me Tyler had packed a bag, left the house, said he needed space to think, and that Melanie was inconsolable. What happened? She demanded, but I kept my tone steady, careful, even confused. I said I hadn't spoken to him. I said maybe he was still upset about the baby shower, about how awkward things got. I said, maybe he's just overwhelmed. I said everything except the truth. Because the truth, the one that now had teeth, was sitting quietly in his inbox, gnawing at whatever trust he had left. And that's when something unexpected happened. I started to feel guilty. Not full-on regret, not the kind of guilt that makes you want to undo your choices, but a quiet, creeping awareness that I had crossed a line, and not for the first time. Because while Melanie deserved consequences, while I still believed with every bitter bone in my body that she needed to finally face the cost of her manipulations, I also knew that this wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about me. About the version of myself that had waited too long for an apology that never came. About the silence I'd endured for years, being told to get over it, to be the bigger person, to forgive and forget and smile at birthday parties like I wasn't still bleeding under the surface. This wasn't about justice. It was about history. It was about the years I spent feeling invisible in my own family, watching Melanie get rescued while I was expected to be resilient. And now, with Tyler unraveling, with Melanie facing a truth she couldn't charm her way out of, I started to wonder, not for the first time, whether I was becoming the very thing I'd always hated about her. Still, when Mom asked me point-blank, Lauren, did you do something? I didn't lie. I didn't confess either. I just said, I think people eventually see what they need to see. That's all. And then I hung up, poured myself a glass of wine, and sat in the dark, staring at my own reflection in the window, wondering how far I was willing to go, not just to bring Melanie down, but to finally feel like I had won something. even if it was only the satisfaction of knowing that this time I wasn't the one who had to pretend everything was fine. Because truth is never just about facts. Sometimes, truth is the weapon you choose when you're too tired of pretending that kindness is still an option. And in that moment, truth was the only thing I had left that felt like control. The knock on my door came just after 9 in the evening, not loud or frantic, but that firm, deliberate kind of knock that tells you the person on the other side isn't leaving until you answer, and when I opened it and saw Melanie standing there, eyes swollen, lips pressed into that fake version of calm she wore when everything around her was about to implode, I didn't feel the victory I had expected. I didn't feel much of anything, actually, just this hollow quiet inside me, the kind that creeps in after the storm has passed and leaves behind a strange stillness, not peace exactly, but the absence of noise. She didn't ask to come in, didn't wait for me to invite her, just stepped across the threshold like she'd done it 1,000 times before, even though we both knew she hadn't stood in my house since before she started dating Paul, and even then, it was only to borrow a dress she never returned. She sat on the edge of the couch like she couldn't decide whether she was staying or just catching her breath before running again, and for a long, unbearable minute, neither of us said a word, the silence stretching between us like a taut rope pulled too far, one fraying thread away from snapping. Finally, without looking at me, she spoke, and what came out wasn't an apology or an accusation, but something simpler, sadder, and much more honest than I had expected. "I knew it would be you," she said, her voice low, tired, not angry, not even surprised, and in that moment I realized she wasn't here to beg for forgiveness or even to fight. She was here because she had nowhere else left to go, because the web she'd spun had finally collapsed under the weight of its own deceit, and the only person left who knew the full truth was the one she had betrayed the most. I didn't respond right away. I just watched her, watched the way her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her sleeve, the way her chest rose and fell too fast, like she was bracing for a hit that wasn't coming, and when I finally spoke, my voice came out more even than I expected. Colder than I meant, but too honest to take back. "Did you ever plan to tell him? Or were you just hoping he'd stay stupid forever?" She flinched, just slightly, and then leaned back, exhaling through her nose, that defensive edge creeping back into her posture. "I didn't know for sure," she said, and then looked at me directly, eyes raw, almost defiant. "And, honestly, I still don't. I didn't do this to hurt him. I didn't plan it. I was scared. I made a mistake." That word, mistake, hung in the air like smoke, and I hated how familiar it sounded coming from her mouth, how many times I'd heard it over the years, attached to every selfish choice she made that left wreckage in her wake. And maybe what stung the most was that she really did believe it was a mistake, not malicious, not calculated, just a chaotic, emotional lapse in judgment that she didn't think would matter once she painted over it with enough charm and baby showers. "You made a mistake," I repeated slowly, the words sharp and bitter in my mouth. "And then you built a nursery on top of it, and dragged everyone else into pretending it wasn't real." She didn't argue. That's what surprised me most. There was no protest, no twisting of the truth, no attempt to gaslight or reframe what had happened. She just nodded, as if she had run out of ways to fight back and now was just letting it wash over her. "You got what you wanted," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "He left. He doesn't talk to me. He doesn't answer texts. My phone won't stop buzzing with people asking what happened. You did it." And maybe she meant it as a condemnation. Maybe she thought it would sting, that it would make me regret how carefully I'd unraveled her carefully packaged reality. But all I could think in that moment was how it felt both satisfying and utterly empty. Because the truth is, when you spend your life being the one who stays quiet while someone else takes everything, and then one day you decide to pull the curtain back and show the world what's really there, you expect it to feel like justice. You expect it to fill the space where your pain used to be. But all it really does is confirm what you already knew, that people like Melanie don't learn from consequences. They endure them like a storm, and then rebuild their myths from the rubble. So I didn't defend myself. I didn't tell her that she deserved it, even though part of me still believed she did. I just said, I didn't do this for revenge. I did it because I was tired of pretending you hadn't already done worse to me. And that finally got to her. Her expression cracked, the mask slipping just enough to show the fear and the shame and the small, raw piece of her that still remembered how to feel guilt. She stood then, too fast, like she couldn't bear to stay another second, and for a moment I thought she might break down, that she might finally fall apart the way I'd done a dozen times in private over the years while she carried on untouched. But instead, she just walked to the door, paused with her hand on the knob, and said, "You were always waiting for me to lose something. Maybe now you're finally happy." And I wanted to say no, I wanted to say it wasn't about being happy, that happiness hadn't factored into any of this, that what I wanted was something deeper, something harder to explain, something that had more to do with fairness than joy. But I didn't say anything. I let her walk out, let the door close softly behind her, and stood there in the quiet, wondering why the silence felt heavier now than it ever had before. Later that night, I sat alone in the living room, the lights off, the room dimly lit by the flickering of a candle I forgot to blow out, and I looked at a picture on the mantel of us as kids, two little girls in matching sweaters, grinning under a Christmas tree. Before we knew what betrayal looked like, before we learned that family didn't always mean safe. And I thought, not for the first time, that maybe I had become something I never wanted to be. Maybe, in exposing her, I'd exposed something ugly in myself too, the part that held grudges so tightly it mistook them for purpose, the part that believed justice and revenge could live on the same shelf. Because even now, even with the truth out, with Melanie unraveling and the illusion shattered, I didn't feel like I'd won. I felt like I'd broken something that could never be fixed. But then again, maybe it was already broken. Maybe I just stopped pretending it wasn't. And maybe, just maybe, that's the part no one ever wants to say out loud.